Hello,
Blog
everybody.
Talk Radio.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me. We had some technical difficulties starting the show off, but I am here. I am going to be joined by author and Minnesota Twins official scorer, Stew Thornley, who will be joining me on this episode. Really looking forward to having Stew here. He is an author. He has written several books. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about what it's like to be an official scorer for a professional team. Now, and that's something pretty interesting. When you think about it, he's the person who kind of decides if it's a hit, if it's a run, if it's an error. I mean, you have to have a lot of knowledge for that, and you have to just know a lot of situations. And we're going to talk to him here. He's running a few minutes late. He's a little bit behind schedule, but that is not a problem. We'll wait until he gets here. But you can go to his website, which is called stewthornley.net, which is STEWTHORNLEY.net, stewthornley.net. It gives you all the books and everything that he's written. It's a really fascinating read. He's a really fascinating guy. If you go there and you click on it, he has not only written a bunch of different books. He is also, like I said, the play-by-play guy for the Twins, and he also co-wrote a book called Holy Cow: The Life and Times of Halsey Hall. He wrote that. A biography of Minnesota sports legend and the first man to use the term holy cow. He also helped Herb Carneal co-author his book. So we're going to talk all about this when he comes on. He does a lot of data casting for the Minnesota Twins. We're going to talk all about that. It's going to be really interesting. I'm very intrigued to see how you become an official scorer for a major league team. That's something that's really interesting to me. We're also going to talk about what role he plays with the Minnesota Timberwolves, which is kind of an interesting thing. I didn't know that he played a role for the Timberwolves. So Stu is here now, so it's time to bring him on. This is enough about hearing me blab. Let's get to the guest, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Stew Thornley.
Hi,
Stu,
Devlin. How you doing?
I'm doing great.
I'm good.
How are you?
Great.
Good.
Very good.
Hey, so I kind of want to talk about how you grew up, getting into baseball, because obviously, you're the official scorer for the Twins. But talk to me before you became the official scorer. How did you get involved with baseball, and what made you fall in love with it?
I just started going to games and playing it, and it was the sport, it seemed, at the time. I was of the age that at the time I started to discover things such as baseball. The Twins had just moved to Minnesota, and I'd watch the games with my dad and go to the games and started playing baseball and did that. But as I continued to do that through high school, I was also reading and enjoying the history of the game and discovering when I went to the game that I enjoyed keeping score of it as well.
Now, you wrote a book specifically that I had mentioned called Holy Cow: The Life and Times of Halsey Hall. What made you decide to write that book?
I was working with a publisher, and his name's Norton Stillman of Noden Press. And in the late 80s, we had hooked up, and the first book that I did was on the Minneapolis Millers baseball team. And after that came out, we did a book on the Minneapolis Lakers, the basketball team. And then he was the one we just went out to lunch at some point right after the Lakers book came out. And I had been at the lunch for a Hall of Fame induction, Minnesota Sports Hall of Fame, that Halsey was inducted, and I was mentioning this to Norton, and it was his idea. He said, well, why don't we do a book on him? And I didn't really know if people would remember him enough, but I was happy to find out that they did. And even though he was, at that point, had been dead for over 10 years. So that's how that book came about. And I've worked with Noten Press on some other books since then, and then some other publishers as well.
Now, we talked about a week ago about one of my favorite books that is, or one of my favorite people that you helped write their book is Herb Carneal. Talk to me about the Herb Carneal book, what that experience was like, and how that came about.
Okay, yeah. After we had done a few books, Noten Press, Norton Stillman and I, and on different people, we first came up with Ray Christensen, and Norton said something, I don't remember what prompted it. He just said, do you think Ray Christensen would be interested in doing a book on his life experiences as a sportscaster and other things? And then, so this was a different type of book where you were the collaborator, where you talk to somebody and even go out and do research yourself and write it up in his words. And after we did that, I guess it seemed natural to do it with Herb Carneal, and Herb was interested. And that whole book went pretty well quickly. I went down to, he spent winters in Florida, and so it was, we had to get going with it before the Twins would have gotten back, before he would have gotten back to Minnesota with the team. So I went down there in, I think, January of '95 and got started with it, and we were able to have the book out by the end of the year. And he's an interesting fellow, and I had grown up listening to him and Ray Christensen, so that was one of the things, is try to put a book into their words, what they sound like, and at least after listening to the person on the radio and then face to face with the person too, you try to get a sense of how they talk, because not everything is just what they might say into a tape recorder and then you just write it out. Sometimes you go off and find information about the games they covered and write it up and try to make it sound like them, and they will have the opportunity to look at it too and make sure that they're comfortable with it. This is a little different than something else, because you are putting words into a person's mouth, and so that person has to look at those and make sure they're okay, but also make sure that it's just how they think they sound or how they would say it.
I think the one question that a lot of people who maybe, or a lot of fans who maybe are my age, in their 30s or 20s, that listening to John Gordon and Herb Carneal on WCCO might ask is, he seems like the person he was as a broadcaster is who he was as a person. Is that pretty accurate? Was Herb Carneal the same person as a broadcaster that he was as a person?
Yeah, he wasn't overly talkative, which is what I liked about him as an announcer, and he was like that as well as you met him, and so a lot of people did get the chance to meet him, and I'm sure found him to be sort of the same way, especially after the book came out, and he would be out signing it, and people would come to see him and chat with him as they were getting a book signed. And I think a lot of the people found that too, as they listen to the person and they start to imagine what a person is like, and don't end up surprised, which is a good thing, that the person is just the way one imagined that person while listening to him.
Now, you've done a lot of traveling. It's on your personal website. It says that you have you've traveled to every major league stadium, and you wrote a book in 2000, or you wrote a book that, came out in the fall of 2000 about one of my favorite old stadiums ever. It's called Land of the Giants, New York's Polo Grounds. How did that come about?
I never was at the Polo Grounds. That's one that predates me, but it's been my favorite, and the odd shape of it. I also enjoyed looking at the stadium diagrams too. As I grew up, I would see all of the American League stadiums on TV and got to know them pretty well, because the Twins played there, and I saw some of the National League stadiums too. The Polo Grounds was last used in 1963, and I don't even know if I ever watched a baseball game live from there. It would have been the Mets, and they probably didn't have that many game of the weeks with the Mets on the Polo Grounds. But looking at the diagram, it was hard to imagine what a place like that would look at. This was 279 feet down the left field line, 258 feet, not 59 feet, something like that, down the right field line, and then 480 feet to center field. And so I started looking for photographs to see what this looked like, and so that was always the stadium that fascinated me more than any other one. It wasn't until the 1990s that I got there to the site. I'd been around the site because it was right across from where Yankee Stadium is now, but to get down there and along the river and look up at the bluffs, so I just became interested in it again and started gathering more information, and then kind of figured, I guess I'm writing a book on it, and that's what I did. It's historic, and there were a number of different stadiums called the Polo Grounds. The reason that, for the name doesn't even have anything to do with the last version of it, the one that everybody would know the best, the one where Bobby Thompson hit the famous home run, or Willie Mays made the great catch. But their original home was north of Central Park on what was a polo field, and they just, as they moved around and moved uptown, they carried that name with them. So it was a strange name for a strange ballpark.
Now, one of the more interesting books that you wrote, it's kind of a non-baseball book, but you wrote a book about Dennis Rodman, and Rodman thought about changing his name a few years ago, and your wife had a pretty interesting response to that. Can you talk about that whole book and what he wanted to change his name to, and what she thought about that?
Yeah, she thought it was a good idea because he was talking about changing his name to Orgasm, which is, I guess, Dennis Rodman-like. If nothing's even surprising coming out of him. So he, and I was just joking around, and my wife said, yeah, that might end up opening on a whole new career path of writing for you if you were to do a book named Orgasm. So he didn't change the name, and that's a children's book, and it was Enslow Publisher in New Jersey. I've done for Lerner Publications in Minneapolis and Enslow out in New Jersey. I've done some different, mostly sports biographies, and that was one of them. And it's different. I did Cal Ripken. That's kind of a straightforward book about a great player and somebody who's not getting into trouble or anything like that too much. And here is a completely different type of subject. So that was, and he, at the time that I did it, he really hadn't seemed to go off the deep end yet. He was just known for changing his hair color and having a lot of tattoos, and he seemed to get a little stranger after that.
Yeah, I still remember, as a lifelong Timberwolves fan, I still remember the night that he was playing there and he kicked the cameraman and that whole thing, and that was kind of crazy. He was with the Bulls at that time. I was at that game, and I remember seeing that. That would be, it's always something with him, and I guess it still is. Yeah, it definitely is. Let's switch gears here. Now, you have a second, you have kind of a secondary career, which is very interesting. You do data casting, and you're an official scorer. What's the difference between being an official scorer and data casting?
Okay, well, I've been doing the data casting for MLB.com, even before it was MLB.com. Operated by Total Sports in 1998. And it is now for MLB.com what the game day is. So if people are at home following a game online on the Major League Baseball website, and I'm not doing a lot of that stuff, that the information that's going in there, the type of pitch, how fast it was, that's going in there automatically from the cameras and radar within the stadium. But then I would just mark if it was a ball or a strike and something more specific on it, and then the outcome of the play. So I'm not making any decisions on a hit or an error. That's up to the official scorer who will be next to me. And then with official scoring, you are doing that. You're not entering it into the computer for people to see. The person next to me is, but there they are, the data caster, and that situation is just taking the direction from the official score on whether to mark something as a hit or an error.
How did you become an official scorer? Like, do you have to apply for that? Like, how does that happen?
It can be just being right place, right time, and for me that meant because I was around there doing these other things with the data casting. But I've been doing it off and on since the 1980s, and it was really more public address announcing that sometimes put you in a position where you're going to be doing the official scoring as well. So it came up in the 2000s. Tom Mee had been doing the official scoring for the Twins for many years, and he wasn't going to be doing it anymore. So originally there were about 4 of us who took his place in 2007, and then it just went down to a couple of us with Greg Wong, who still does it, and then there's been a couple of other people who have been in there as well. So that's been going on. I've been doing it for the Twins games since 2007. So I'll be doing some games data casting and some games official scoring.
What's been your favorite Metrodome moment, and what's been your favorite Target Field moment as an official scorer or data caster?
Okay. Well, I was a data caster when Cal Ripken got his 3,000th hit at the Metrodome. That was in 2000. And I did the playoff game against the Yankees, which was the final game that was played at the Metrodome, the final Twins game played there. And that was 2009. Favorite for official scoring at Target Field, probably the All-Star game, because that was just a great experience. That was a good game. And that was just a real, I spent the whole weekend going to some of the different events, and then the culmination of that was the All-Star game. The other interesting one was a couple of years ago, Andrew Romine of Detroit played all 9 positions in the game, and just following that around was interesting as well. And at least nothing controversial that came up with any of that. They were just pretty straightforward games. Right.
Now, in 2013, you mentioned being an official scorer. In 2013, you were actually named to the MLB Official Scoring Advisory Committee. You guys have annual meetings at the league headquarters in New York. What are some of the things you guys talk about at those meetings? I mean, obviously, you can't give me full details, I'm sure, but just kind of give us a general idea of what the Senior Advisory Committee or the Official Scoring Committee talks about.
Okay, the first time that we ever had one of these meetings was 2012. And getting the scorers together for the first time was a fantastic experience. And there were different topics that we had to discuss. For example, when would you call a stolen base instead of defensive indifference, things like that. So but we also look at plays, and that's probably one of the biggest things that we find valuable is that we can all look at a number of plays together and discuss them. Is that a hit or an error? And we start to zero in a lot better in standardizing our calls, which is what the real objective is. And at that time in 2012, there were 3 people who had been named to the advisory committee, and then one of them in the next year is no longer doing official scoring, so I was asked to be on it. And we'll come out a day early and meet And we've already talked about an agenda or format for the school, but we'll go through it more and take on different projects. I wrote kind of a case book to go with a rule book on interpretations, because sometimes you read the scoring rules and questions can come up. Even though it's there in the rules, you can always find situations to say, well, what if this happens? How do you rule on it? So I was the one who wrote that. We're doing other things. A couple of us are going to be training, training, I guess you'd say, Eastern League scores. So some of the minor league scores on Tuesday, we've got a Zoom call set up to go over some different things with them. And but getting together, looking at things, and there's more and more technology that's coming out now that's helping us. The biggest thing is just to be able to see how other scorers are calling different types of plays so that we can try to call them the same way. And we're getting more and more stuff sent to us on a regular basis of plays that are appealed by teams. Teams have the right to appeal a scoring decision to Major League Baseball. And if they send that in and appeal it, then it also will go out to all the scorers. They'll send it out after the whole thing's been processed, after Major League Baseball decides if it's going to change the scorer's decision, which it usually doesn't, or if it does change it. But we get to see many, many more plays and see that, hey, the official scorer called this a hit. And it was upheld by Major League Baseball, or it was changed. And there's more technology coming at us. When you go to the ballpark now, you can see that StatCast information going up on the board, how hard the ball was hit and things like that. And scorers have a different mind on whether they like that or want to use that. To me, it's just like one more check to, if I know a ball's hit hard, but maybe I can then look at the scoreboard and see that it was hit at 103 miles an hour, and I can definitely say it's not just it was hit hard, it was hit at 103. And maybe if a team wants to appeal a scoring decision, and I can even use that in my response to say, well, that ball was hit at 110 miles an hour. I can remember one where a pitcher was unhappy because an error wasn't charged to a fielder, and when I was able to say, well, that thing was hit at 110, that was a really hard hit, and put a number to it as well. But they're doing more and more with that, and that, well, I'm interested to see just what kind of an impact it will have on official scoring or helping us out. It's not going to automate it, which sometimes people get a little bit nervous about, like, gee, they're just going to take the job away from us. And I don't think there's any great danger of that.
One of the cooler things you got to do was in March 2017, you got to go to Guadalajara, and you were the official scorer for the World Baseball Classic. Talk about that.
Yeah, that was quite an experience. They play the World Baseball Classic every 4 years. And then in 2017, the opening pools were in Seoul, Korea, Tokyo, and down in Guadalajara. So I went down there. My wife, who speaks Spanish, came with because she served as a translator in the press box if I would announce something as a hit or an error, and then she would repeat it in Spanish. And there were 7 games. We had not the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico and Venezuela, Italy, and Mexico. So especially between Puerto Rico and Venezuela, it's almost like an all-star roster of the top players: Miguel Cabrera and Carlos Correa, Francisco Lindor, Salvador Perez, Felix Hernandez. And that went to a tiebreaker for which team was going to advance, and that was a good game. In fact, Venezuela was trailing by a run in the 9th inning, and Miguel Cabrera hit a 2-run homer. They were long games, and it was just a great experience. I enjoyed a lot of good games there, and I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that wasn't that the year that the United States won the whole tournament?
It was. They finally, in the end, beat Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico had won. It was undefeated in the pool when we saw them, and then Venezuela had to play a tiebreaker game to get that second spot, and Puerto Rico made it to Los Angeles, and the final game was against the United States, and the U.S. won that one. It was kind of a blowout. It was the second game in the Classic that Jose Barrios pitched in. And in fact, the Twins were not too happy with his lack of usage. I think he started the season in the minors just because he was gone for 10 days and pitched only twice. But we saw him pitch against Italy and really saw that curveball that he pounded in there. We gave up 3 runs in 5 innings with only 3 base runners. There was a walk and a home run, and later Drew Butera of Italy hit a home run. The only 3 base runners he allowed. And then he didn't pitch again until the championship game, and it was just in a mop-up role. But the U.S. did beat Puerto Rico to win the Classic that year.
Now you've obviously had a lot of experience as an author and a writer and a official scorer, but people might be interested to know that you also did PA announcing for high school and college basketball for over 30 years. Yeah,
I was in broadcasting, and so some opportunities just sort of related to that would come up. And I started doing basketball at North Hennepin Community College in the early 80s. And then they dropped their basketball teams, and I went to Minneapolis Community College, and then eventually was at St. Louis Park High School. So I always enjoyed that as a chance to get to the game. Mostly basketball, but, it could be anything. I did football at St. Louis Park for a while, and kind of once in a while a soccer or volleyball. And I've also for about 25 years been doing some of the public address announcing for the Minnesota Gophers baseball team, and then also the state high school tournament just once a year out at Siebert Field, and have a couple of days. So I don't do it as regularly or as much as I used to. I think 2011 was the last year that I was doing it regularly for a team, but still occasionally for the Gophers, and then once a year for the high school. I enjoy it. It's just an announcing background. I did play-by-play announcing when I worked in radio, and the public address announcing a little easier. It's fun. It gets you at the games. It gets you involved. I always enjoy that.
It's going to be a big summer for the Twins. It's June 1st as we're recording this, and they are retiring Joe Mauer's number this summer. They have their annual Hall of Fame induction ceremony this year with Joe Nathan and Andy McPhail coming in to the Team Hall of Fame. And most importantly, they have me throwing out the first pitch of the game this summer. So it's going to be an important summer for the Twins. Talk to me about
you're going to be auditioning for Gardenhire. Is that it? In case he needs another arm?
I'm going to try to do a little bit better than that girl in Chicago did the other day.
The thing is, I've seen worse, but it was before the social media days, which is maybe a good thing. But yeah, she kind of pulled the pitch right into that photographer. But I have seen worse.
Talk to me, Stu, real quick. We're running out of time, and I don't want to hold you up. Talk to me a little bit about what that Joe Mauer number retirement means, and what kind of he means to the Twins, and if you have a Joe Mauer story you can share.
Okay, yeah, I loved Mauer as many did, although in the final years he was getting criticized, and part of it is how it goes with baseball contracts, or how it went, is somebody gets underpaid for the years that he's really productive, and then gets the big contract, and just things changed, especially when he was no longer able to catch. I remember that game. It was the Mets. It was a makeup game because they had gotten rained out against the Mets early in the 2013 season. And when they came back and played that, it was he took that foul tip so hard into the mask, and he never caught again except for that token appearance in his final game. But the years that he had, and he was so good, and I hope that, I followed more Hall of Fame voting sometimes, not just who do I think should be in there. I definitely think Mauer should be in there. But to see players, if they've had a career that was the upside was on the first part of it, and then the end of the career maybe makes people forget how good they were in there. But I think Mauer as a catcher stood out so well because he was an outstanding catcher, but the hitting that he was able to do, and I think that's, if somebody looks at the overall career for him, I think he will make the Hall of Fame. I think he's deserving of it. He was just a steady player, professional hitter his entire career, and he wasn't the kind of guy who was going to be making headlines other ways, which is a good thing. So some other players might stand out in different ways, and Mauer just quietly did his job and did it well, and it's a Hall of Fame career, and so they'll retire his number, and he'll of course be in the Twins Hall of Fame, but in another 5 years we'll be looking to see what the voters in the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown are doing.
Stu, I cannot thank you enough, especially we went over by a few minutes. We were a few minutes late. I cannot thank you enough for being willing to come on and talk to me about your books and your career. If fans want to send you a fan letter or get an autograph or something, what's the best way for them to do that?
I guess send something to the Twins, because it will always get through to me. And I don't get that many fan letters, so I'm sure it will get through to me. It's not like they're going to be too clogged up with that kind of stuff, but that would be the way to do it.
Sounds good. Stu, thank you so much. I had such a blast.
Sure, thank you, Devlin.
It's been my pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, same here. I'm looking forward to seeing you with that first pitch this summer.
I look forward to trying not to screw it up. Thank you.
Yeah, you won't. You'll be fine. All right, thanks a lot, Devlin.
All right, thanks, buddy. Yeah, take care. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was Stew Thornley. As you can tell, he's had an amazing, amazing career. We didn't even talk about it a whole lot, but he's actually been the backup official scorer for the Minnesota Timberwolves. On his website, he mentions that it's less controversial because he doesn't make all the judgment calls that players, coaches, people like that tend to get upset about. He just records points, fouls, and timeouts. So, guys, I cannot tell you, Stu is one of the most personable and friendly and amazing people that I have had the pleasure of interacting with since I've been doing this podcast. Go to his website. It's packed full of information. He talks about all of his books, the Minneapolis Miller books. He talks about the official scoring. He even gives libraries of plugs. And he talks about one of my favorite things, which is graveyard hunting. He talks about a lot of the graveyards he's been to, both baseball Hall of Fame-wise and famous figures. So go to that. It's stewthornley.net, stewthornley.net, stewthornley.net. I've got some other good guests who are willing to come on and that I have lined up, and I am looking forward to doing this podcast on a more regular basis. Thank you to everybody who has stuck around. I appreciate it. Thank you very much, and we'll see you down the road in podcast land.